And I just hit the record button. So for those of you that want to jump off at some point or have to jump off at some point, I know you don't want to, but some of you have to. We are going to record this and we'll send it to you after. But thank you all for joining, and thanks to David for coming on and chatting. If you're anything like me, you probably are on less sleep than usual most Mondays now. I find myself watching these documentaries and staying up, tossing and turning. And but I'm grateful to have David here. And just to get started, I'm going to put a couple norms out there for the group just so we can try to make this as successful of a time as possible. Number one, if you put it on speaker view, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you just go up to the top right corner and you can hit gallery view or speaker view. If you hit speaker view, you'll really see me and David as we go back and forth having these conversations. You also may see somebody named Joey Romansky, who has worked for me as an intern for a couple of years now. He's at Northwestern University, and Joey's going to be monitoring the chat. And so if you have any questions as we get going, Joey's going to take some notes and he might jump in with some questions for David as well. So once again, any questions that you have, just throw it into the chat. Also, we're just going to have you all muted the entire time just so the focus can really be on David. And as I said, we encourage you to just turn off your video. If you want to see the speaker, you can also minimize. So these are just little things that you can do in Zoom to make your experience better. So if you hit that minimize button, it'll allow you to really see David. And other than that, the format is going to be, I'm going to start by facilitating a discussion with David. I certainly have questions from last night and from all the other previous docs and just from growing up and watching Michael and the Bulls. So I'll start with David. Then I'll ask some questions that you all submitted beforehand. So thanks to those of you who submitted questions. And then we'll really go over to Joey and we'll monitor the chat. I know someone already has put in, Chick Hernandez has put a message in the chat. David, I don't know if you know Chick. Do you know Chick?
Of course.
So
Sure.
Great golfer, Chick Hernandez. Also great voice, Chick Hernandez. So that's how we're going to do this. We are going to let this flow, let this roll. Thank you all for being here. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction on who is in the room. So we have college and high school coaches in the room. We have professional athletes and professional coaches in the room. We have business professionals, authors. It's really a diverse group that is in the room. And you're all people that are in my network in some capacity. So grateful to all of you for your support always. And hopefully you'll find today interesting. I know you will. A bit about David, if you don't know, he's best known for representing sports icon Michael Jordan for the entirety of Michael's career. But besides Jordan, David also represented more than 100 NBA players and is generally considered to be the most influential player agent in NBA history. In 2000, he had at least one client on all but 2 NBA teams. And at one point, he represented 40 players at a time. He was listed among the 100 most powerful people in sports for 12 straight years. He was also named to the top 50 marketers in the US in 1995. And he negotiated the then highest contracts in NBA history for Patrick Ewing and Danny Ferry as rookies, right, David? Is that what that is when they were coming out? Yep.
That 55 players drafted in the top 10.
Yeah, so a lot of superstars. So we all focus on MJ, but he's been around iconic superstars. And we're going to talk about some of the mindset that went into a lot of those players. He also negotiated Alonzo Mourning's contract, which was the first $100 million contract, which was unprecedented in the NBA. While he was at Fame, which was the company he started, he really changed the entire salary structure in the NBA, negotiating more than $400 million in contracts for his free agent clients in just a 6-day period. So David's been in the trenches when it comes to basketball at the highest levels. And he was also heavily involved with the creation of Space Jam, which I know my son has enjoyed while being in quarantine. He watched it for the first time. And I think I texted David and said, when we were watching the Jordan doc, he said, "Oh, that's the guy from Space Jam." So it's interesting to see how the world changes. And obviously David was heavily involved with the Air Jordan brand that today has become a billion-dollar business. And then lastly, David's book, The Bald Truth, I highly recommend reading. It's a great read. David, as you'll learn pretty quickly, is a great storyteller, and there's lots of great anecdotes and stories in that book as well. So that's David. as a reminder, for those of you that I know closer than others, I work as a mental performance coach and executive coach, and I've been fortunate to work with some of David's players over the years, and it's always been a joy collaborating with them and helping them maximize their mindset. So that's enough as far as introductions go. Before we let all of you in from the waiting room, I said to David, one of the big takeaways I had from last night was that Michael talks a lot about energy. And he seems to say, well, my energy wasn't really into stuff outside of basketball. My energy was really solely focused on basketball. And as you're watching the doc, at least as I'm watching the documentary, I'm taken by Jordan's ability to connect with people along the way and seemingly create an energy within the rooms that he enters. So David, you spent so much time with Michael. You know him when he was at North Carolina, and then you know him today. What's it like being in the room with him from an energy perspective?
Well, first of all, he's an extremely nice person. And if you've never met him, you see him in, one of his teammates brought a couple of his high school buddies or college buddies in. He really is very inclusive. It makes you feel great, but he's an incredibly focused person. And, particularly during the years of the doc, when he came back from his first retirement at age 31, he knew he had about 5 peak years left. And he really upped his focus. He really amped it up because he didn't come back to make money. He was making tons of money. He came back to win. That was a singular focus. And unlike a lot of today's young players who are worried about their branding and their social media and how many followers they have, his whole focus was on basketball and winning.
And the other thing, as far as energy goes, is there's a scene with him and Jerry Seinfeld. And once again, you could just see his presence, like Jordan's presence. Talk about, like, from a presence standpoint and his ability to own a room.
The most interesting example I give you that, when we were negotiating for the movie Space Jam, I visited all the major studios, Sony, MGM, Paramount, and Warner Brothers seemed to show the most interest. And to recruit him, they threw an amazing party at Bob Daly, who was the chairman's house. It's actually his girlfriend, Carol Bayer Sager. They invited 25 A-list actors, big-time people. And I was really curious to see how Michael would interact with these megastars in Hollywood. And they were intimidated meeting him. They were shy, nervous. It's like a bunch of high school kids meeting your idol. And he was calm and cool. And that's just the way he is. He's got a really strong confidence level with people. He's meeting with the heads of companies, presidents, whoever he's meeting. He's got a very strong level of confidence.
And the documentary last night ended with him questioning his desire to take on being a role model. And of course, Charles Barkley was famous for saying, I'm not a role model. And so the documentary is at a point now where you can see Michael has, lived in this spotlight, and he's really looking like he wants to get away from the media and get away from all that stuff. And he's saying, like, I don't want this anymore. Yet the branding, a lot of times, be like Mike, the Gatorade slogan was all about being a role model. Talk about that tension that existed maybe earlier than people even realized for Michael, as far as what it was like to be a role model and be a brand.
Well, first of all, I think he never intended to be a brand. Unlike a lot of today's athletes who come out and they don't get drafted, and you say, what's your number one goal? And they say, I want to create a brand. You want to tell them you don't even have a brand. I think what happened over the course of his career, Brian, is that the level of media increased. We didn't have social media back in 1984, but the level of media increased. And as the scrutiny of every little thing that he did got dramatically more intense, it became obsessive almost. The gambling was a great example. And it interfered with his focus on basketball. And it's not that he stopped wanting to be a role model. It's just that I think, as any human being would, I think he began to resent the level of intrusion into his personal life that the media was creating. So he's a great interviewer. He's very gracious with his time, but you can't satisfy. And then people start asking these controversial questions like, was he suspended by David Stern? Was it because of gambling? Everybody wanted to have the scoop on what really happened. They started inventing these dramatic theories for very simple things that never happened. And so I think that he probably drew the line a little tighter as he got older. And again, I think a lot of that derived from his basic, he wanted to focus his energy on basketball. And the more distractions he had, the more distractions the teammates had, the harder it was going to be for him to accomplish his goal.
It's interesting because I think about Kobe Bryant, and Kobe really was not open during his playing career. And then post his playing career, he started to do interviews and really started to share his genius with the world. And so it was interesting watching Jordan figure that out maybe a little later, whereas Kobe, and maybe, Kobe had a watershed moment where he was accused of sexual assault. And that it's interesting to just think about that path and how someone opens up versus closes in and then opens up again. You mentioned the gambling stuff, and Michael.
I think Kobe, as a personality, was much more of a loner. Like if you talk to his teammates in the first 6-7 years in the league, he most of the time stayed in his hotel room, ordered room service, didn't go out, didn't hang out. He was sort of a loner. Whereas Michael's really is a guy's guy. I mean, you go out with Michael, he really takes care of we went out one time to play golf in Chicago with about 20 players. Jerry Rice, his football guys, Richard Dett. Michael organized the forces into 5 groups based on your talent ability. I was in the C group. And at the end of the time, it rained. We had to stop. He took everyone into the pro shop, bought them rain suits, arranged for transportation to get him home. I mean, he really is like a really thoughtful person. Whereas Kobe, I think most of his career, almost his entire career, was very much a loner, didn't hang out with the guys. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying really dramatically different personalities.
But both were competitive, and there's no doubt you hear both those guys were just so competitive. And Michael says in the documentary, I didn't have a gambling problem. I love competition. Like I might have had a competition problem. What's the dark side of being addicted to competition?
Well, the dark side is when you stop something like playing NBA basketball or football, hockey, but whatever you're playing, what do you substitute for that intense level? You have millions of people watching you on TV, you have thousands of people in the stands, you've got the media scrutinizing your every move. What do you do to substitute that, to fuel your competitive fire? It's very, very hard. And I think because of that, a lot of athletes find it difficult to walk away. They're hooked on the competition. And even when their body tells them it's time to go, that their skill level is declining, their impact is declining, they just have difficulty walking away from the fame and from the competition. Michael, even though he is a competition junkie, walked away at age 29 at the prime of his career, sort of a la Barry Sanders or the famous football player Jimmy Brown. It's rare in sports.
How similar are you to that competitive nature? Like you were, as we mentioned, in this thing at the turn of, the century, and, spotlight on you as well. Or do you have that competitive spirit and desire to, compete like Michael did?
Yeah, my mom taught me at a very early age. She was my life's mentor. She was a teacher and a linguist. She was an interpreter. And she taught me at a very early age the following mantra: always shoot for the stars and never settle for second best. And so I would say that if they rate competitors like a type A, I'm a type A plus. And one of the ironies, I think, is that while clearly, I don't have Michael's talent, no one has Michael's talent, I think that he saw in me someone that was trying to compete in business, sort of in the same vein that he was trying to compete in basketball. I think that created a bond for us. He knew that I was self-motivated. He didn't have to tell me, David, this is a really important contract. I really need you to focus on it and, don't play golf or whatever. He knew that I was extremely self-motivated and that I recognized that working for people like Jordan and Ewing and James Worthy and Iverson and John Thompson, Coach K, creates a tremendous challenge for you to bring your A game every night. Like you can't say, gosh, gosh, Michael, I'm really sorry, on this endorsement. I just really wasn't into it. I had a headache. I had a migraine. I couldn't compete tonight. But like, you have to bring your A game every night because that's what his greatness demands.
I've been talking to a few coaches about the documentary, and the word alpha just keeps coming up. And then last night in the documentary, they said he's the alpha's alpha, and referring to Jordan. What do you make of that word alpha? How do you make sense of it? What do you think about that?
Well, I think, I understand the connotation. I think in my career, I would say that every superstar that I watched compete, whether it was Magic Johnson, Hakeem Olajuwon, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Patrick Ewing, and go on and on, they all possessed one quality in common. And that was they had in their DNA some gene that made them want to be the Terminator. They didn't just want to beat you. They wanted to destroy you. They wanted to stomp on your throat. And I think that that's what separates the truly great of the greats from talented players who are very good players, but they don't have that drive to kill you. And because of that instinct, I used to tell the owners, you could pay people like that. You could pay them $1 million, you could pay them $1 billion, you could pay them $1 trillion, and they're going to do everything exactly the same. Whereas most players reach a certain level of financial comfort and they really stop competing. They don't work out as hard. It's like in the scene in the documentary when Jordan said, okay, we just won the championship. Tomorrow we're going to start working out again. Who on earth says that except a person that's incredibly driven for perfection?
Sorry, let me just.
Okay.
Yeah, are you there?
Yeah.
All right, there we go. Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned Jerry Rice earlier. Jerry Rice was the same way. After they won the Super Bowl, there's a legendary story of him going to the practice facility the next day and running wind sprints. I think it was Steve Young who tells the story of being in the locker room, clearing out all his stuff. And Jerry, who just won the Super Bowl MVP, is there running wind sprints. So birds of a feather, they're similar.
Great Jordan story. Okay, so in about 91 or 92, I'm not exactly sure what year, Gary Williams at Maryland asked us to represent a player from Maryland named Keith Booth, who is a great guy. I like him as a friend today. It wasn't like we were trying to recruit Keith Booth. He was a fringe, late first rounder, mid second rounder. But we agreed to do it because of respect for Gary. And we got him drafted, I think, the next to the last pick in the first round by the Bulls. So Keith's a 6'5", strong, 2'3", and he's going to the Bulls having just won their first title. And he's going to be playing behind Michael Jordan. So I said, Keith, if they call practice at 10, you better get there at 9. So the first day he gets there an hour early. Jordan's in a full sweat. Next day gets there 15 minutes earlier. Jordan's in a full sweat. This goes on for like 4 or 5 days. One day he gets there like 2 hours early, and he finally beats Michael to practice. The next day he comes, and Jordan has coffee and donuts waiting for him at the practice facility. This is the greatest player in the game and a rookie who's going to make it 2 years in the league and then become a coach. And Michael's making a statement to him, no one's going to outwork me. I may be the best. And that's who he is. That's how he manifests his competition. He's sending a message. You
said something to me yesterday that, while he's this ultimate competitor, he always got along with his coaches. And we have a lot of coaches on this call. Why do you think he wasn't a coach killer when so many superstars are?
Well, I think it started with his parents. His parents were great people, and they were very, very hardworking people. And sort of like my mom with me, they clearly consistently told Michael and his siblings, hey, you did a great job. Now you could do it better. Go out and prove yourself. You got to keep growing. And he learned that at home. He was a late bloomer. He wasn't a 14-year-old who was the number one player in the country. He didn't really come into his own pride. He didn't make the varsity until his junior year. And then he goes to Carolina, where he plays for one of the greatest college coaches of all time, Dean Smith, who's extremely disciplined. He wasn't the best player on his team. That was clearly James Worthy, who was the number one pick in the draft at the end of his first year. He also happened to play with Brad Daugherty, who was the number one pick in the draft 2 years after Michael came out. Sam Perkins was the fourth pick. So it wasn't like he was the only show in town, and it was in his in his nature, in his character, in his development. And so he respected every coach he had. He respected Kevin Locklear. He was a fun-loving guy when he was a rookie. Stan Albeck. He had a great relationship with Doug Collins, who he brought to Washington when he ran the Wizards. And so it wasn't like that Phil hypnotized him and changed a guy who was a coach killer, made him a coach lover. It's just his nature. And I would say, in my experience, just like you talk about the DNA of superstars, in order to win, certainly at the pro level, probably in college or even in high school, the best player on the team has to be dialed into the coach's philosophy. If he's not, it's not going to work. So one of the most famous stories I ever heard in basketball, James Worthy told me the story. He's on the Lakers. Michael had a teammate named Orlando Woolridge from Notre Dame. He was a chiseled 6'9" power forward, nephew of Willis Reed of the Knicks. And he had a substance problem. They sent him into rehab. They traded him to the Lakers. He gets to the Lakers, and in the height of Showtime, Worthy, Magic, Kareem, Cooper, Byron Scott, and they're in practice. And Woolridge is not much of a practice player. He's loping up and down the floor the first couple of days, and Magic's watching this, and he's doing a slow burn. Now, Riley didn't have to say anything to Woolridge. Magic, on one play, whips him the hardest blind pass he can, splits his mouth open, goes into the locker room and gets about 8 stitches, comes out with bandages on, and Magic turns to him and said, "Hey, by the way, in case no one told you, we run the fast break here in LA." Now, if you're Pat Riley and you have that disciple on the court enforcing your will, if you're the coach of Boston, you got Larry Bird, you got Michael Jordan, you got John Stockton. Wow, how much easier does that make your job than if you got the player on the floor screaming at you in the middle of a timeout or breaking the action? That's what it takes to win at the highest level.
You mentioned Magic and Larry. So the Dream Team, the documentary shows Jordan exhausting all efforts to win a championship. And then I think they said like 10 days later or whatever it was, he's like, Riley, I think he said, or Daly, he said, Daly better not play me much. And so this is kind of a 2-part question. The first is this idea of load management that's become popular in the NBA. And you watch Jordan get this physical abuse from the Pistons, from the Knicks, and just playing, so many minutes. Also, Jordan notorious for, maybe I know with the Dream Team, like staying out late and showing up early. And, the guy, everyone that you talked to said he could work hard and play hard. And you're watching him smoke cigars, you're watching him drink beer. I mean, so the first part of my question is, was there ever a thought about the physical rest? And certainly there was a part in the documentary early in his career, I think year 2, where they're trying to rest him to get a better draft pick and that whole thing. But that was a little different than load management. So the first question is around physical. And then the second is around the Dream Team and the marketability of that. And they talk about him becoming a global icon with the Dream Team. So can you just shed some light on if you were ever concerned about his physical well-being? And then secondly, what the Olympics did for him from a marketing standpoint?
I learned early on, probably his rookie year, he's single. He lived in an apartment in Northbrook, Illinois. And I go to the games every couple of weeks. This will blow your mind. I'd fly to Chicago. He would personally pick me up at the airport in his Corvette, his Chevys. We'd go to the game, we'd have dinner, come back to his place, and we watch movies. Now, it wasn't watching game film. We're watching like triple headers. Like, I think the guy, right away, I think he's maybe a vampire, doesn't need to sleep. He didn't eat that great his first few years. Like, he was eating a lot of McDonald's and fries and steak. And he just has an incredibly high energy level. And early on, he never believed he would live like past his mid-50s. And so he, I guess, was trying to enjoy it all, while he could. And he was so incredibly fit. He worked so hard in training. I wasn't worried that he was going to burn out. And you realized he was performing on the court. So you didn't have to worry that, what he was doing off the court was interfering with his ability to play. As far as the Olympics are concerned, obviously Michael played in the Olympics when he came out of Carolina in '84 on the college team. And that's what was really his coming out party, I think. And before a world audience, he showed things that he had never been allowed to show playing in Carolina. I mean, everyone knows this has been repeated 100 times. The most famous line about Michael Jordan is that the only human being that ever kept him below 20 points a game was Coach Smith at Carolina, because they played such a disciplined offense. So he gets to Barcelona, and as he explained, it's probably the greatest basketball experience of his life, because unlike today's players, you look at today's players who are all trying to sort of get together, like LeBron wants to play with Wade and Bosh, and Durant wants to play with Kyrie Irving. And I don't criticize that, but if you ask Michael, like right now, we got him on the Zoom and said, do you ever want to play with Larry Bird and Magic Johnson? He'd look at you like you had lost your mind and said, of course not. I wanted to kick their ass every day to let them know I was the best. So he gets to Barcelona, and he's playing with all these guys that he's friends with. He's good friends with Patrick, Chris Mullin, and he has an amazing experience. But there's clearly, at this time, he's trying to show that it's no longer Larry and Magic's game; it's Jordan's game. And
David, did he want to go? Did he want to go, or was he resistant to going?
He didn't really want to go, because it was just another, it'd been a long season. He's tired, mentally tired, from all the focus he put on. And initially, I really didn't think he was going to go. But he had a tremendous friendship with Rod Thorne. Rod drafted him in 1984. Rod is one of the people that I most like and admire in the NBA over, almost 50 years. Just he's a great guy, and he and Michael have a really special relationship. And I think when Rod put the call out, Michael heeded the call.
You mentioned Rod Thorne, and the other central character in the documentary so far has also been Jerry Krause. And Matt Grabler, John Wallace. There were a bunch of the questions that came in were around Jerry Krause and people being interested in that character. What's your thought on Krause, A, and then B, why was it that he was the one that seemed to have Jerry Reinsdorf's blessing when you had legendary Jordan, legendary Phil, even Pippen? Like it seemed like Krause had Reinsdorf's ear. So what's your perspective on that dynamic? And I'd love to just hear from you.
Well, first of all, I'm really good friends with Jerry Reinsdorf. I really like the guy immensely. I really respect him. I think he's one of the really smartest owners that I've ever had a chance to deal with. He was the owner in two sports, the Bulls and the White Sox. And no one can really ever figure out why he had Krause as the GM when you could have so many people be the GM of a team with Michael Jordan. And I think more than anything else, he was like a filter for Krause. He irked people, he annoyed people, he got under their skin. And then they go to see Reinsdorf, and they were malleable. Like they said, he was like a marinade. He softened them up. And so when they finally got a chance to go to the Court of Appeals and see Jerry Reinsdorf, I think Jerry was a very insecure guy. He wasn't a bad person. I mean, people say he was not a bad person. He was annoying, but I think he was very, very insecure. And so as a result of his personality, instead of doing mainstream things, he took the long shots so that if it hit, he could say, oh, anybody would have taken, Johnny Dawkins in 1986, who's the National Player of the Year. I took Brad Sellers, who's a complete bust, and he had a proclivity for taking these long shots.
Was Scotty, David, was Scotty that? Because Scotty was coming from a school that people hadn't really heard of. Was Scotty more of, would you give him credit for sort of finding Scotty?
Yes and no. I think Scotty was a perfect complement to Michael in many ways, not in every way, because Scotty was not a great competitor. He was an amazing athlete and an amazing performer, but you didn't see it in the doc, but if you watch Jordan to the Backs, which is an IMAX movie I produced, there's a scene I think it's in Utah, where Pippen doesn't want to play in the finals because he has a headache. Jordan is playing with food poisoning, scores 38 points, and he grabs it by the singles of his jersey, and Michael's he's screaming at him to make him play. And so I think Scotty was great for Michael because he was so amazing defensively. And when they ran the triangle, he fit into the triangle because he was sort of a point forward. But in that year's draft, I hate to confuse people with the facts, Scotty was the 5th pick. Now, if they'd taken the 6th pick, it was a guy named Kenny Smith of North Carolina. They desperately needed a point guard. They signed John Paxson, who I later came to represent. He's a very dear friend of mine. You can't compare John Paxson and Kenny Smith. The 7th pick was Kevin Johnson, who's an amazing point guard for Cleveland and Phoenix. He was the 7th pick. Reggie Miller was the 11th pick. So instead of having Kukoc later on, if you wanted a guy who was a dynamic scorer, could have had Reggie. So almost any one of those players he drafted could have fit in. But I do give him credit for getting Pippen because it worked. The one thing you have to say, whether you like Krause, you dislike him, whether you think he's a genius or a jerk, guy's got 6 rings. And if Krause had just learned to tone it back, people would have said, wow, the guy's got 6 rings. In his generation, only 2 guys had 6 rings, Red Auerbach and Pat Riley. So it speaks for itself. When I started representing Michael, I was 33 years old. I was very young, and we did things that had never been done before, a lot of things. We opted out of the group licensing program, first player in history to do that, and the second in history and last was Patrick the next year. We got him his own line of shoes and clothes. We got him national endorsements when Bird and Magic didn't have any. And I was cocky as you could imagine for like the first couple of years. And after a while, I sort of sat back and said, wow, you're on a team with Michael Jordan. You're like Steve Kerr. You don't have to say, hey, we won the championship. Everyone's going to know what you did. Let your work do the talking, or better yet, let Michael do the talking. Krause never learned that. He wanted everyone to understand that it wasn't the players, it was the organization. Now, I love the organization, which John Paxson's run for the last 17 years. How many championships have they won? How many championships has the organization won since Michael stopped playing in 1998? 0. They had one run with Pippen. They got to the conference finals and lost to the Knicks, I think in 94. And so Krause's personality got in the way of his performance. It's a great lesson for athletes just to learn to step back and let your performance do the talking.
It's interesting because since his time, the most dominant franchise in the NBA has been the Spurs. And if you listen to Popovich and R.C. Buford and the leaders of the Spurs, they're always talking about the players. And, Tim Duncan was really the person they would always talk about. Well, we've got Timmy, and they also would talk about the organization. I think they call it a program. Hey, we run a program, but make no mistake, they were quick to say, Tim Duncan is what helps make this program run. So I think that's where you can find both of those.
Because those are confident people. Greg Popovich is the best coach in the NBA in the last 15 years. He's the Olympic coach now, and he's really smart guy. R.C. Buford is an amazing general manager. Another guy, he's sort of in the shadow of Pops. Does he complain and say, wow, if I go to, some other team, I could be the number one dog? No, he loves being in San Antonio because he's winning. He's got a great camaraderie with Greg. Greg uses him as a buffer. And so those are like polar opposites of Krause's personality.
What do you look for in players? Like what makes a player great? I know Jamie and Christian, the GW head coach, was curious about, hey, what makes players great? A lot of other people put questions in like, hey, what are you looking for when you're signing people? What qualities or traits do you look for?
I've said this many times to owners when I counsel owners. If I owned a team or ran a team, I would look for 3 things. I'd look for skills. Most players today don't have the skill level they had 20 years ago because the style of play has changed where they all want to be sports center players. They want to run and dunk. There are coaches in the NBA that tell me they stop practice and they put tape on the ground and say to the player, this is where your feet belong, because they don't really know that. I'd look for intelligence because I've never met a great player that doesn't have a really high basketball IQ, and often a very high IQ in general. And thirdly, I look for character. You cannot win in any business, sports or industry, without people of high character that understand their roles, that are willing to work hard, that are willing to accept authority. And in sports, everyone preaches they want to have character, but then they find a player who's amazingly talented, and whether he has a drug problem or he comes from a really rough background or he's a diva, and they say, I'm just going to take this one guy, and that one guy changes the whole chemistry, and it makes the rest of the players lose respect. Now, I learned this the hard way myself in 1998. That's a really funny story. If I take 2 minutes. I get back to the office from lunch, and this is back in the days when if you got a telephone message, you had this spindle, and you had paper messages, they stick them on the spindle. So I got a message that says, Steph called with some Atlanta number. I had no idea who it was. So I returned the call, said, hello, how you doing? Fine, how you doing? How was your summer? We're shooting the shit for like 5 minutes, and I have no idea who it is. So I finally said, excuse me, like who is this? And they said, well, who do you think it is? So I took a guess and said, Stephon Marbury. Now, if I was going to call like Obama while he was president, I wouldn't say, yo, this is Dave, give me a buzz, I just say, David Falk, Michael. So we signed Marbury, and everyone told me that he was an impossible guy to manage. And they said I might be the only human being on earth that could manage him if I stayed away from his family, who was toxic. And we had 2 great players on his team. Keith Van Horn, who was the second pick in 97 behind Tim Duncan, and Kerry Kittles, who we got drafted by New Jersey in 96. And we told them if they draft this guy named Kobe Bryant, that we wouldn't resign our free agent. So they took Kerry Kittles from Villanova. And these guys are really bright guys. Kerry Kittles has an MBA from Villanova. Van Horn has probably made more money after basketball than they played. And they came to me and they said, David, can I ask you a question? I said, sure, you can ask me anything. So you're having some kind of financial problems? So financial problems? I just sold my business for a lot of money. They said, really? Then why on earth would you sign Marbury? I said, oh, come on. I said, Marbury's not a bad guy. And they looked at me and said, David, Marbury is a bad guy. And my stature with those guys went down 2 or 3 floors because they really thought I'd lost my quality control level. And I resigned from Marbury about a year later. He was impossible to work with.
David, why do you think you did? Why is it that you think you decided to sign him?
Why did I do it?
Yeah.
Very simple. My ego got in the way of my judgment. John Thompson, who everyone knows, is like my most important male figure in my life, my hero in life. I love the man. He called me in his office after he heard I saw Marbury. And he says to me, son, can I ask you a question? I said, sure, you could ask me anything. He goes, do you think because of your tremendous success as an agent and your dynamic personality that you're going to be able to change the kind of guy Marbury is? I said, of course, that's why I took him on. He said, let me give you some advice. Get over yourself. You're not a social worker. You're not a spiritual advisor. You're a freaking agent. You're not going to change a guy once he hits 20 years old. You can influence him, maybe, but you're not going to change. A leopard's not going to change his stripes. And he was 100% right.
David, so I have to go here, which is Thompson took a risk on a young man who a lot of people said he shouldn't have, in Allen Iverson, who you spent time around as well. Why do you think that worked at Georgetown for him, and why was that different for him than Marbury for you?
That's a great question. I asked him that question at the Georgetown banquet, I guess at 94. He announced that he had signed Iverson. I was stunned. I had never met Allen Iverson. I knew he was a great player in both football and basketball, state player of the year. But because of the incident in the bowling alley, not knowing him, the publicity was pretty negative. And he just smiled. But Allen revered John Thompson. And John basically told him, this is the way we're going to do it. And one day, Iverson stepped out of line. I never learned what the offense was. He did something that pissed John off. John called him into his office. And he said, son, you came to me from jail. And if you ever pull that shit again, I'm going to put your ass right back in jail. And Iverson was scared to death of him. He respected him, but he was scared of him. And Allen never missed a practice at Georgetown. He was never late for a practice. He's a really smart kid, kept up with his academics. And it worked. It worked. And, I told Iverson to go back to school for one more year at the end of his sophomore year. He asked me, said, you're going to be the number one pick in the draft. You're going to go from the cocoon at Georgetown, where John doesn't let you talk to the press the first 6 months you're in college, and you go to Philadelphia, which is the toughest media city in the United States. And I promise you that for 22 hours a day, you're going to hate being in Philly. The 2 hours a day you're on the court, you're going to love it, which is exactly what he told me at the end of the year. And finally, John said to me, David, give it up. He's got to go. And so I went up to him later and said, of all people, someone who stands for education, how can you condone and recommend that Alan leave school? It's the first player ever from Georgetown to go early. And he said to me, one of his brilliant lines, said to me, I never want to be a prisoner of my own reputation. And what that meant to me is that, yes, he stands for education, but you can't be monolithic in your approach. You've got to be able to make exceptions.
Alan Stein was curious about how you were able to sustain success for such a long time, how Michael was able to have success in his 30s. What do you think the key of longevity is?
Commitment. I think you can't rest on your laurels. You can't say, here's what I did 5 years ago, because every night you go out, you're going to get tested. No one cares when you're doing the last dance in 98 that you won the title in 91. They want to know, what do you have in 98? Do you still have it? Are you still motivated? And because Michael had this incredibly obsession with competition, he had it. For me, I did my dream job. I had this notion when I was a freshman in Syracuse, and I met the 2-star players who were on my dorm floor, and we became great pals from day one on, that I'd become an agent when I was a senior in college. And one of them got drafted. He was the 6th leading scorer in the country, sort of a Steve Kerr type. And I realized when I was a senior that if he hired me, I wouldn't have a freaking clue what to do. Some of the young agents today might take a cue from that. But and so I went to law school, and it's something I always wanted to do. And so over a period, I'll give you a period of like 5 years of my career, from 82 to 86. I was 32 years old to 35. I had a chance to represent James Worthy in 82, Michael Jordan in 84, James Lofton, who retires the all-time leading wide receiver in the NFL in 84, Patrick in 85, Chris Dolman, the 5th all-time sacker in NFL football history in 85, John Thompson, Johnny Dawkins, the National Player of the Year, and Boomer Esiason. Now, that's the only clients I ever had. I might be in the Hall of Fame for agents just for that small group of guys. And I realized I was living the dream. And I wanted to let these guys know, because I was very young. I wasn't as established as I am today. And I wanted to let them know I was going to work nonstop to justify them picking me, the confidence they gave me, the loyalty. I mean, think about this. In today's world of agents, you got these big companies like Wasserman, Octagon, CAA, that have, the Hollywood agencies, and young players gravitate, Rock Nation, they gravitate to all the fluff. They're going to be in movies, they're going to be rappers, they're going to manage their social media. Michael could have been with any of those companies in 1985. He could have been with William Morris, the largest, most successful, entertainment agency in history. He could have been with the largest PR agency. And he stuck with me through being at ProServe, being at Fame, selling to SFX, Clear Channel. And I've told him 100 times, there aren't enough words in the English language for me just to simply thank him for his loyalty, because he could have been with anybody. And all those guys stuck with me, and it motivated me to bring the best that I could bring to the table every day.
So this is going to be the last one from the pre-questions, and then Joey is going to hop on and ask some questions. I know I see a lot of your questions in the chat that I'm curious about. So hopefully Joey's gathered some good ones that he'll share with you. But Moshe Winanu, who's a friend of mine and works in the media, he asked this question, and I thought it was really cool, which is, what went into the facts of I'm back?
Okay. So I consider myself to be a really good writer. Now, your dad, who's one of my dearest friends, is a great journalist. When I read his birthday letter every week, I don't think I'm that good of a writer. So a little shout out to Bruce. But I go to Chicago because he tells us he's going to come back. And I wrote 4 or 5 drafts of a press release. Now, sitting at the kitchen table in Michael's kitchen was my dear friend John Lesage, who's the president of Burstyn Marsteller, the largest public relation agency in Chicago. And I showed John. John liked them all, but Michael just it didn't ring his bell. And finally, he said, "Look, just give me that damn piece of paper." He takes the paper and the pencil. He writes 2 words, "I'm back," and it was absolutely elegant in its simplicity. And so I called up Allison Sadowski, who's our PR director. And back then, we didn't have Zoom and stuff. We actually had faxes. She faxed it out to all the people, and it became. There were more words. Like the press release sort of said, the following statement was released by David Falk, Michael Jordan person. There was more words to the intro than there was to the statement, which shows you how a little out of perspective we were. We just should have had nothing, just said "I'm back."
Awesome. I said that was going to be the last question, but there was one that came in to the chat that was also a pre-question that I have to ask, which is, look, Michael was better at basketball. This is actually my friend Matt Weber's words. Michael was arguably better at basketball than anyone has been at anything in a very long time. What are some key things that are holding him back as an owner? Obviously, Charlotte has not had amazing success. They've had some pretty good years, but why do you think he was so dominant as a player and not quite as dominant as an owner?
Well, my answer would be very simple. I think that Michael's so loyal to the people around him, and he doesn't like controversy. He likes consistency. That I think a lot of the people he hired aren't the right people, but he's hiring people either to help them or to give them jobs. The one glaring exception I'd make to that is Fred Whitfield, who worked for me for a few years, who's done an amazing job as the president of the Hornets on the business side in building up tremendous relationships in the community. Bob Johnson, who I really like, took Charlotte, which is a banking capital, put all the banking relationships for the Bobcats in New York. But Bob did a lot of things because he's a very smart guy, but that pissed off a lot of the people in Charlotte, in the community. And Michael had to build a lot of bridges. And I think he hired people that are nice people and work hard, but some of them aren't, a lot of them aren't the right people. And I've never tried to interfere. If he asks me questions about Charlotte, I tell him I have very little role in running the team, in working with the team. And I think that while I don't agree with Krause that, organizations win championships, you have to have a great organization in order to win a championship. And I think they could upgrade it. I think hiring Mitch Kupchak, who's a seasoned pro, was a really good move in that direction.
Great. Joey, let's go to you, and to everybody else, feel free to continue to put questions in the chat. David's agreed to stay on to 1:30, which is pretty cool. So we've got him for another 4.
Right?
What?
Overtime.
Well, we're going to pay you extra for sure. Joey, make sure you unmute, and why don't you just take some of the questions? David and I were joking before. Joey's like serving as our stat guy, a stat boy from PTI, but we're not Kornheiser and Wilbon here. We're doing the best we can. But Joey,
Kornheiser, I shave it all off. I'm not trying to hide it.
You're more like Wilbon right now. I'm kind of like Kornheiser, hanging on for as best I can. Joey, go ahead. Ask a question to David. Joey, do you need me to unmute you? All right, let me get you. Hold on one second. Power of being a moderator, I guess.
All right, there we go.
There we go.
Awesome. All right, so we got a lot of great questions here. One of them that stood out from Tisha Penachero. She's curious to know if
First
you.
I want to say hey to Tisha. We know each other from SAC. I know I just learned last week she's in Washington, so big fan.
Perfect.
Tisha's a legend. Hold on. Tisha's a legendary basketball player who played with flair, and awesome human being as well. And she's involved. I'll connect you guys. Tisha. Hi, Tisha.
Awesome. She is curious to know, David, if you have changed your recruiting strategies over the years, especially in terms of recruiting players from this generation, and if so, why?
Okay, so I say I'm probably, for a successful agent, the worst recruiter in the history of agents. And most of the great players we've had a chance to represent, we didn't recruit at all, zero, including Michael Jordan. In fact, it was not allowed. So until about 95, when they put a wage scale in and allowed agents that couldn't pass the test on the collective bargaining agreement to negotiate contracts. All the great players we represented, we were invited in by their coaches, whether it was Dean Smith at Carolina, Coach K at Duke, John Thompson at Georgetown, Bobby Knight at Indiana, Roy Williams at Kansas, Rick Pitino. And they told the players, this is who you want to go with if you want to get paid the most money. And so we had two players, for example, Patrick Ewing at 85 and Danny Ferry 90, who were the highest paid players in the history of the NBA before they ever played a game. That can't happen. Zion Williamson can't make any more money if you hire CA than if you hired, you. And I think that's bad. It's like saying a player can't make a difference on the court because you can only score 10 points a game. So we don't recruit at all. And I'd say beyond that, Tisha, that today, and I'm not angry about this, it's just a sad fact of life, there is so much corruption in the recruiting. There probably are 3 players in the first round that don't get paid significant amounts of money by their agents. It's illegal. The union's supposed to police this, and they do a terrible job policing their own rules. They might as well just have no rules because it's like the Wild West out there. And I would, if you told me I could sign every player in the first round in 2020 for a penny apiece, 30 cents, I'd pass. I will never pay a player $1. I think I'd lose every ounce of respect both for myself and for people like Michael and Pat and James Worthy and John Thompson, whose relationships I value deeply. And so we're basically, I have a young partner, Danielle Cantor, who's the only woman in the world today that represents NBA players. She's a rock star. She's a double graduate of the Wharton School in Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania. And she represented Malcolm Brogdon, who was the only player in the last 50 years in the NBA to be the Rookie of the Year, to get drafted in the second round. And she signed him last summer for $86 million as a free agent. And you'd think that people would be calling her up and saying, gosh, I saw what you did for Brogdon. And they won't, because they know she's not going to pay them. And the local AAU coaches in town, know that we don't pay the players. And they're looking for help with their programs, whether it's legitimate or not. And so we're becoming like dinosaurs. And I wouldn't give that up for anything. That's who I am. I'm straight. And if I could never sign, I don't intend to sign any more players. But Danielle certainly is going to sign 4 or 5 more good players like Brogdon. And so the recruiting is a cesspool.
Joey, I'm just going to jump in. David, we got a question from Randy, and this was a question that a lot of people asked Connor Bestie, a coach as well, which is around college players getting paid, and especially the NCAA now granting likeness and that sort of stuff. What are your thoughts on the NCAA and what they should do and how that all should play out?
Well, first, and I discussed this with Condoleezza Rice in her committee at Stanford last summer. I gave a blistering report to the NCAA. Inherently, I think that there's clearly a problem because the players are creating so much money for the NCAA and they don't share in any of that. And on the other hand, I think that if you really were objective and said, if the NCAA 30 years ago let players get paid for their likenesses, there probably aren't 3% of the players in the country that legitimately anybody would pay for their name and likeness rights, because they're worthless. You'd pay Zion Williamson, you'd pay, LeBron if he had gone to college, you'd pay, Elton Brand, you'd pay Michael Jordan, you'd pay the Christian Laettner, Grant Hill, but most of these guys have no value in their license rights, and they're not going to be NBA players. And so it's almost like more theoretical. It's going to be interesting. Now, what I worry about is that some of these schools that have unbelievable alumni groups, I'm not going to mention specific schools that have been cheating for years. You say to a kid who couldn't get a hat deal for $25, if you come to my school, we think we can get ABC Hat Company to pay you $100,000. It's just going to ramp up the cheating even more. On the other hand, in my opinion, in 2 years from now, when the NBA allows high school players to come out directly into the league, which I completely disagree with. I think it's the dumbest thing for the league possible for many reasons. I think that very few really good players are going to go to college. I think this year, for example, I don't know the exact number. I think somewhere about 240 players have declared for the NBA draft, whenever that's going to take place, for 60 spots. And so you could have 180 guys that are in for a really big surprise who have agents or advisors or someone telling them, hey, you are really good. When you walk in the gym, everyone's going to realize how talented you are. Put your name in. And so I think that matter. I think most colleges 5 years from now are going to be like Butler's program under Stevens. You know, going to be really good college players who stay 4 years, that maybe 1 or 2 are on the fringe of being an NBA player. But the days of, you know, Kentucky having 5 number 1 picks in the draft under Coach Cal, those days are over.
Joey, what's another great question you had from the chat? Oh, I got to unmute you again. Sorry about that. Here we go, Joey.
Okay, awesome. We had one earlier from Brian Krifsher. He says, David, you spoke about the aura around MJ, even among A-list celebrities. How did you yourself avoid being awed in the way of doing your own job?
Great question. So first of all, when I represented Michael in 1984, I'd been in the business for 10 years, and I was the junior agent for Stan Smith and Arthur Ashe, 2 number 1 ranked tennis players in the world. I had worked for James Worthy, who was the number 1 pick. I worked for Phil Ford from North Carolina. You know, was the National Player of the Year. John Lucas, who's the number 1 pick, who played professional tennis. So it wasn't like this was like new to me. And the second way I'd answer that question is, because I was so young, I was very conscious. I'm not that much older than Michael, 12 years. And I was very conscious. I never wanted to be one of his boys. He had tremendous friendships with 3 guys named Fred, including Fred Whitfield. And he was great friends with his college roommate, Buzz Peterson. And they hung around, and he would laugh with them and drink with them and have fun with them. I didn't want to be one of the boys because I didn't feel he would respect me if I was like in the entourage. So I sort of drew an artificial distance so that when I told him really important things I think he needed to do, that he would respect me. And I really didn't loosen that rein probably for at least the first 5 years till I felt my own sense of confidence that we had developed this relationship of trust where he knew I was going to always tell him what I thought. He might not agree with it, he might not like it, but he had to know, because I was his advisor, that when he got into a situation and needed advice, I wasn't just going to be one of the boys and tell him what he wanted to hear.
Awesome. Joey, you got another one?
Yes. We had one earlier from Jason W., who was wondering, what is one endorsement for Jordan that did not work out and why?
There weren't any endorsements that didn't work out. I'd say the only one that he had an issue with was his last deal was with a telephone company called WorldCom. And WorldCom ended up selling to I think to Sprint. And so it worked. It just the company had some financial problems. He had the golden touch. Everything he touched turned to gold. Most people were skeptical. They said, look, okay, he did hamburgers. What makes you think he could do fragrances? And I said, trust me, we're not doing a lot of endorsements. We were very selective. He only had about 10. He could have had 110, like Joe Montana. And we were very selective. Not as selective probably as Phil Knight would like to. Phil Knight wished we would have done 0, just Nike. But I didn't think that was smart for Michael to put all his eggs in one basket. But I was very conscious of the possibility of diluting his name and image if we did too much. And they all worked.
David.
Today, he did Gatorade in 1991. He's still with Gatorade. He did Sara Lee in 1991. He's still with Sara Lee. I mean, the foundation I created for him has stood the test of time, and that's what I'm the most proud of.
David, you mentioned, and he mentions like having the singular focus on basketball, yet as a kid growing up, we saw Jordan everywhere. And even you talk about it, which is before him, it was tennis players. It was those types of athletes. And so you were quoted recently as saying he had $100 million opportunity for an endorsement to go show up for 2 hours and he turned it down. And you told me stories in the past about him turning down opportunities to make money, just go play golf. And what was that like being his agent? And, having all of the opportunities come his way, him wanting to let his basketball do the talking. How did you manage that? I think there are a lot of agents on this call. I'm curious how you navigated those waters of everybody wanting a piece of Jordan, and when there were really great opportunities for him to cash in, how did you navigate that as his agent?
Well, let me separate that into two parts. So part one, he comes into the NBA in 1984. And while this is almost incredible for anyone to imagine, Magic Johnson and Larry Bird both had deals with Converse and Spalding basketballs. Magic had a 1-year deal with 7-Up, 1 year to do 7-Up. Other than that, he had no national endorsements. Nobody called us up when Michael got drafted and said, God, we got to have Michael Jordan from McDonald's or Coke or Chevrolet or anything. We leveraged relationships we have with these companies over a long period of time for our tennis clients or different things we were doing, running tennis tournaments, sponsors for tennis tournaments. And we leaned on them and said, just sign this guy. So this will blow your mind. Michael's first deal at McDonald's was local, Chicago and North Carolina. Each region paid him $25,000 a year to endorse McDonald's. At the end of 2 years, the woman that ran Carolina did not want to renew the deal because she couldn't understand how she could possibly use an African-American basketball player in the state of North Carolina to promote McDonald's. I think she's now working in Afghanistan for McDonald's. And so nobody was looking for Michael Jordan. Once we started the process and developed a foundation, Coke, McDonald's, Chevrolet, Nike, Wilson, I told all the companies, this is like a country club. Once we get to 10 endorsements, we're not going to allow anyone else in. So if you don't think he's worth it, no problem. But don't call me down the road and say, hey, can I join the club? I'm going to say, no, I already have 10 members. So that's what happened. So once we hit the 10, we just stopped. And we told the people along the way, we kept layering it up. So in 1991, I told all the companies after being in the league for 6 years, if you want to move forward, we want 10-year contracts for a minimum of 7 figures a year. Gatorade was the first. And by the time we did the phone deal, we got up to 10-year deals at a minimum of 8 figures a year. And so there was a process that self-screened the deals. McDonald's wasn't willing to give us a 10-year deal. We just didn't renew. It wasn't negotiable.
And to shift gears a little bit, Stu Singer put in the chat, how important was MJ spending 3 years at North Carolina under Dean Smith to becoming who he became? Meaning if it was today, he would have only played 1 single year in college. And I want to just add to that, which is LeBron didn't go to college, Kobe didn't go to college. And you think about, you had LeBron today, you had Kobe before, and then you had Jordan. I mean, there's other great players in there as well. You've often talked about Jordan being a late bloomer. And so I'm curious if you could imagine what would his experience have been like if he had to leave North Carolina after 1 year?
So the coaches on the phone will love this story. Michael told me this maybe his 5th year in the league. He was the National Player of the Year as a sophomore. And he went to see Coach Smith and asked what he thought about the possibility of leaving college to go pro. And I'm not giving an exact quote because Dean didn't curse very much, but Dean basically said to him, Michael, you are an amazingly talented player on offense, but you basically suck on defense. Why don't you come back to Carolina for 1 more year? Let me teach you how to play defense, and then you have my blessing to go pro as a junior. Now, if you ask me, and I'm biased, if you took out Bill Russell, who's the greatest defensive player in the history of the NBA, I'd say the second greatest is probably Michael Jordan. And when he wanted to D somebody up, he was way better than the Glove or Rodman, who was amazing, and that was a product. I think Coach Smith taught him fundamentals of basketball at a very, very high level. I said to Dominique Wilkins once, I represented Nick for 5 years, and I was trying to get him to try to become more cerebral in his approach to the game. He was he might have been a better raw athlete than Michael, certainly comparable. And I said to Nick, something, when you can't jump anymore, you're not going to be able to play NBA basketball. And he said, what about Michael? So what about Michael? When Michael can't jump, he'll be Larry Bird. Because his footwork, he was so incredibly fundamentally sound. And that's what I talked about earlier when I mentioned skills. He learned that at Carolina. He had a thirst for learning. And Coach Smith is one of the great coaches of all time. You know, he didn't pamper him. You know, he didn't say, hey, you're so good, you don't need to get better. He pushed him really hard. And I think that's what made Michael great. I think Kobe socially could have benefited enormously by going to college for 1 year. He always talks he would have wanted to have gone to Duke for a year and played for Coach K. LeBron is a complete outlier. I say it's the ultimate compliment. I never believed that an 18-year-old player, regardless of how talented he is, who came in with the expectations that LeBron came in, his high school games were freaking televised, could have met the expectations as gracefully as he has. Now, he hasn't been perfect. I think he's made a few mistakes along the way. I think that, you know, the movie, The Decision, the little thing he did with Jim Gray was not well thought out. I don't agree. He should have done Space Jam, which is Jordan's movie. But I'm a big LeBron fan, and I think he handled, for a person who'd never gone to college, he's handled the transition amazingly well.
One more question for me. I'll kick it back to Joey. You mentioned Dean Smith. You mentioned Coach Thompson. I know you spent a lot of time with Coach K. There are a lot of college coaches on this call. What do you think made those three coaches iconic? I don't know if you ever interacted with Don Shula. You mentioned a lot of football coaches, but Don Shula just passed away today. What makes those coaches special?
I think they each had dramatically different personalities. John Thompson was Coach Smith's assistant coach at the 1976 Olympics. They had a very, very close friendship, sort of a Mutt and Jeff. And they were opposite in almost every ways, but each in his own personality. You know, John has a dynamic personality. I think John has whatever a double PhD would be in human nature. He understands human people really well. He's an incredible motivator. He's really smart. I think Mike is like a very modern guy. He prides himself on adjusting. I got to tell the coaches a story, Brian. I hope this is
okay.
So. You and your dad are going to know who I'm referring to, but I'm not going to name by name. I was trying to put one of our NBA players on a team, and I called the coach. The GM loved the player. The coach didn't love the player. And I said, what don't you love about him? And he said, Dave, you have to understand, I have a system, and the way our offense runs, I don't think your player would fit into my system. Now, my two biggest coaching clients, John Thompson, Coach K, John called me in his office one day when I was in my late 30s. I don't know why. And he said, David, do you like to gamble? That's why I enjoy gambling, but I'm very conscious. My dad lost every penny he ever had gambling, so I'm really weary of it. But I enjoy it. I like to play blackjack. And he said, well, what do you like about it? Oh, I said, I have this system called progressive betting, and I like to use it in Vegas. And he started laughing, really laughing. And I said, what's so funny? He said, son, the casinos send private jets for assholes like you that have a system, because you come out there and you're going to lose all your money. They love people that think that they're going to beat the house. Nobody beats the house. Now, Coach K is nationally known for being a proponent of man-to-man defense. He's famous for his man-to-man defense. But about 5 or 6 years ago, he had 5 freshmen start for the team. And he knew that he didn't have the time. The NCAA restricted the practices to 20 hours a week. Didn't have the time to put in his very complicated man-to-man defense. So he played his zone. And you know what happened? Duke won the national championship. So I told this coach, you know, if you were Coach K, you would never have run the zone because it's not your system. You'd rather not have won the title than to say that you're going to break your system. So, you know, Mike, I think, is a very modern guy. He's adjusted well to the one and dones. I can't imagine he likes the one and dones as much as having the Grant Hills and the Danny Ferrys, the Christian Leitners, and Johnny Dawkins for 4 years. Dean was a math major. He was a really brilliant guy. The players had the ultimate respect for Dean. I don't think he was socially maybe as close to the players as Mike or John is, or maybe Rick Pitino. Same thing with Bobby Knight. Bobby Knight is like a genius. I love Bobby Knight because he's a purist, and he did it the right way. He didn't cheat. He really cared about players. And those people had the opportunity to be with these players for 4 years. And I would say John, for sure, Dean, they knew every single thing that those players were going through. They knew if they were breaking up with their girlfriends, they knew how they were doing in school. They weren't just a 2-hour-a-day coach on the court. They were like a life coach for those kids, and they formed lifelong relationships. I mean, John's relationship with Patrick Ewing, or Dikembe Mutombo, Alonzo Mourning, even Allen. He's like a dad to those guys. And I know that our Duke clients, like Danny Ferry, Johnny Dawkins, Elton, have very, very close relationships with Mike. And so to me, that's what a college coach is all about. It's not just being a pro coach. It's having like a role in helping these players develop from the time they're 18, hopefully past when they're 19, but that's hard to do anymore.
Joey, what's the question that stuck out to you?
Yeah, for sure. We had one come in recently from Van, who was wondering, what's the greatest principle you learned from Michael that you've applied to your own life and has impacted you the most?
Wow. First of all, I would say unabashedly that I've learned a great deal from my clients because they're all the best in the world at what they do. I've learned a ton from Michael. When you play cards with him, he loves to play cards. He always says, his expression, a bird in the hand, which means if you have a great opportunity now, seize the moment, take the opportunity, don't be greedy. So one day we're playing, and I had a full house with aces and kings, one of the best hands you could possibly have in poker. And I'm betting my ass off. And Michael says, hey, you obviously have a great hand. You probably have a full house. What if I have 4 of a kind? Like, lighten up on the betting. You might get me out. And I didn't, I figured it was just housing me. So I kept betting, had a lot of money on the table. And he had freaking 4 nines. He beat me. And so I learned a bird in the hand. He had another expression he taught me during the lockout in 1998 when I was working my ass off for the players to try to convince them you cannot get locked out and lose $1 billion because you don't have the leverage to make the kind of deal you want to get from the league. And he was very, very vocal during the lockout. Patrick was the president. We had Juwan Howard, Mutombo as office, Alonzo as officer of the union. And Michael said to me, David, you cannot help a person that does not want to help themselves. The players don't want to help themselves. They all think they're locker room lawyers. And he was right. And so sometimes you try really hard to change a person or mold a person, inspire a person, but they have to want it themselves or it's just not going to work.
I thought this was a really cool question from Cody Royal. Who's a player from another sport, either in the U.S. or global, that you would have loved to represent and why?
Oh, wow. Okay. Tiger Woods for sure, because I love golf. He obviously is like a younger brother to Michael. It would be fascinating. Derek Jeter. I hired Derek Jeter's agent, Casey Close, in, I'm going to say like September of 1991. And on September 5th at 6 p.m. at Hamburger Hamlet, a half a mile from my house, we signed our first baseball client named Kent Merker, who's a relief pitcher for the Reds. At 9 a.m. the next morning, I resigned and went on my own. And I took all my basketball clients, all my football clients, all my staff, and except one person, Casey, who I wanted to keep badly, but I just felt a lot of guilt. My boss begged me to. So years went by, and I'm down in the Bahamas at Michael's golf tournament, playing blackjack. Michael, Charles Oakley, Barkley, and Derek. I'd never met Derek, who's an amazingly great guy. And I said, I hired you for your agent to work for me. He said, really? He said, yeah. I said, we signed our first client on January 5th, and I resigned the next day. And he said, was that client me? I said, no, if it was you, I wouldn't have resigned. So I would have loved to work for Derek Jeter.
Hey, Dave, I want to jump in because Jeter and Tiger are fascinating. I mean, Jeter is this guy who, Mr. New York, bachelor, didn't settle down until way later. Tiger really
didn't settle down either.
Tiger from a branding standpoint, similar to Jordan, right? Like there was this logo, there was this aura of Tiger, this dominant of Tiger that since Jordan, I mean, the next dominant athlete was Tiger. So it's interesting though, because Jeter sailed off into the night, played for the Yankees, Mr. Yankee, and now is having to deal with being an owner and the challenges that come with that. And then Tiger, we all are aware of. If you were working with Tiger, what would some of your messaging have been to him? Would you have consulted him to do anything different than how he has gone about his career?
The one thing I would have done, and I'm a big fan of Tiger's current agent, Mark Steinberg, who actually represented Vince Carter, started out in basketball, really good guy. You know, no one on this call will believe what I'm about to say, but if you ask me, what was the greatest compliment Michael Jordan could pay you? It wouldn't be that I made him a lot of money or I created his brand or I invented Air Jordan. It would be that I taught him how to become a good businessman, how to make really good business decisions. So all the things we did from day one were very inclusive. And I said, these are the choices. This is what I'd recommend. This is why I'd recommend it. This is the game plan. And Michael is a really, really smart person, but he was inexperienced in business. And my mom was a teacher. So I think the thing that I do that's most important for my clients is I try to teach them. I try to teach them about the business of basketball. And for all the coaches on the phone, I love talking to parents. I talked to a parent of a really talented young player the other night. And his father said, when he walks in the gym, everyone's going to know how good he is. And I want to say, really? Well, that would really surprise me, because there's 250 really talented kids going to walk in the gym. You have to understand the business of basketball. And I think Tiger, because his dad was so dominating in his life, has made some really bad decisions. We all make bad decisions, but when you're not used to making your own decisions, I think it makes it really hard to be, no matter how smart you are, the smartest people in the world have the most smart people around them giving them advice on how to make decisions. And people who aren't comfortable having those people around them are basically insecure or narcissistic.
David, you mentioned Tiger's dad. Michael's 29 years old, loses his dad, right? And decides that he wants to go play baseball. And Darren McMahon's asked this question: when Michael decided to leave basketball to give baseball a shot, how did you respond to his idea of doing that? Did you talk about it? Did you support him? Did you try to talk him out of it? What was that like?
Okay, I gave him the exact same answer I gave him a few years ago when he turned down the $100 million endorsement. He called me up on a Saturday at home. I wasn't say completely, I was largely unprepared for this. I knew that, the baseball thing was the back of his mind. I knew his dad always dreamed that he'd play baseball. And I loved his dad. His dad was a really special guy. And he calls me up and says, okay, I've made a decision to retire. Now, if you understood our relationship, Michael is the ultimate tweaker. He's constantly affectionately needling you to try to make you better. He's not trying to make fun of you. He's just trying to have fun. And I knew he expected me to say, oh God, you're kidding me. You're going to retire from basketball at 29, having won 3 titles in a row. You can't do that. So I fought my natural instinct to do that. I kept quiet for about 30 seconds, which, as you know, Brian, you know me well, might be a world's record. And I said the following to him: Michael, it is the American dream to work really, really hard at doing something, become really, really good at it, maybe the best in the world, and use that performance to make a shitload of money. And once you get to that position, you could then do whatever the hell makes you happy. And you've done that. You worked your ass off for many years. You're the best in the world at what you do. You've made a lot of money. And if playing baseball is your dream, go for it. And I thought that decision was the most courageous decision he probably ever made in his career, because he's giving up the comfort of being the GOAT in basketball with all the adulation, the money, the endorsements, to try something that he hasn't done since junior high. He hasn't played baseball since junior high. Now, if you asked any Major League Baseball player who played basketball, JV basketball in 7th grade or 9th grade, do you think you can go to the NBA and score 15 points a game? It's not a prayer in history they could do that in a college, maybe in the G League. And he got a lot of criticism for playing baseball, particularly from Sports Illustrated, which I think was the biggest mistake they made in the history of the magazine. And the guy batted 200. Now, as you know from reading Moneyball, the difference between batting 300 in the major leagues and batting 270 is one hit a week. So batting 200 is not going to win a batting title, but having now played baseball for probably 15 years, pretty damn good. And Reinsdorf said on the documentary, had he stayed at it and the strike hadn't come, he probably could have made the majors. So that's what I told him.
Joey, you want to ask David, I think there was a question about conflict. I'd be really curious to get David's perspective. I think the question, who was it from, Joey?
It's from Austin Peters.
Yeah, so
Austin Powers?
Austin Peters,
Oh, sorry.
who's also in the basketball coaching world. Was there ever a time where you and him really went at it and had a conflict and didn't talk for a few days, or just were in such disagreement?
Yes. So again, my job is to be Michael's advisor. And I know that there could be times that he's going to either ask a question or I'm going to have to give him advice on a topic that he's not going to like. And my job is not to be Dr. Feelgood. It's to be his advisor. And so when he got involved in the gambling problem they talked about in the doc with Slim Boulaire, who was being watched by the FBI, and he had to write him a check for $150,000 that he lost in gambling debts. I'm home in Washington. I'm watching the Bulls play right while this is going on. And after the game, he does a press conference, sort of like the one he did with Ahmad in the doc, wearing sunglasses. Now, this is not, Michael's not a sunglass guy in the locker room. Who's the guy in the Washington Wizards who wore sunglasses locker room? And he has some crazy name for it, like it was like his chi or something. Jordan Crawford. And I flew out to Chicago first thing in the morning. I knew we had a problem. I landed at the airport, pick up a copy of the Chicago Sun Tribune, and Jesse Jackson, who was really big at the time, is quoted as saying, "This is ridiculous. Michael Jordan can hang out with whoever the hell he wants to. It's no one's business who Michael Jordan hangs out with." So sort of coming back to your earlier question about being a role model. So I sit down with him after practice and I say, Michael, you didn't rob a bank. You didn't commit a crime, but you definitely made a mistake in judgment. You can't hang out with people like this and tell young kids that you're a role model. And he went ballistic and said, I knew you were going to say that. All you give a damn about is the endorsements. And I knew you were going to protect the companies. And I got mad and I said, look, I don't give a shit about the endorsements. I'll cancel them all tomorrow. I said, but you have to make a choice. Either you're telling kids that you're a role model, and you could exercise better judgment who you hang out with. You can't hang out with mafia types. Or you can cancel all the endorsements and hang out with whoever you want. But you can't do both. That is a conflict. And he was steaming. I mean, it's the maddest he's ever been to me ever. I really was worried he was going to fire me that day. But you have to stand up to the challenge when you're working for people at this level. Whether it's John Thompson, who could be extremely forceful, or it's Coach K, people older than I am, or it's young people like Michael. So that night after the game, he goes to the press conference, no sunglasses this time, and he says, I want to apologize to my family. I wasn't raised to do this. I want to apologize to the Bulls organization. And the thing went away. Now, if you think that I felt great, wow, I just won one with Michael Jordan, I don't want to have a confrontation with Michael Jordan. I don't want to risk being fired. But if he's asking for your advice and you don't have the confidence and the courage to tell him what you know he needs to hear, then you should just quit. And we didn't have a lot of those. And I would say that the strength of our relationship, why it lasted as long as it did, why we're still friends today, is that he knew in crunch time that if he asked me a question, I would always give him my best advice. I didn't expect he'd always agree with it. I didn't expect he would always follow it, but I wanted him to know that I would not punk out and do what most of the agents do today and just tell him what he wants to hear because they're worried that you're going to get fired and sign with somebody else.
This is a question from Josh Rosenblatt, who you know. And I'm going to tweak his question a little bit. You mentioned Jordan's shoe deal in the documentary was going to be a success. It would be a success if it sold 3 million. They end up selling like $120+ million. If he had gone with Converse, what would Jordan's path have been like from a shoe company? If he had been one of the other Converse guys, where would we be today when it comes to his brand from a Jordan brand perspective?
Well, it wouldn't have been a Jordan brand. Converse was like the institution. They were the official shoe of the league. They were the official shoe of the Olympics. And we went to visit him. Michael didn't go to Converse. His dad went with me, James. And one of the funny, somebody wrote, I saw a tweet. I don't tweet anything, but I followed it. Like when I made a comment that Michael's parents were intelligent, they acted like I was surprised. I wasn't surprised. I could have said that they were athletic, they were fast, but they were very, very practical people. And his parents got a education in the shoe business by visiting all these companies. So Converse was last. And James and I went along, and Converse basically, their pitch was the following. They had 60 employees at Converse in Reading, Massachusetts, that was 6'6" or taller. And we sat down at the table to discuss the deal. They didn't present anything. They said, we're going to treat you exactly the same as Larry, Magic, Dr. J, Bernard King, Isaiah Thomas, Herb Williams, all the guys they have. And so James said to, really? Don't you have any new creative ideas? And I was like asking, like, creative ideas? Like, what does that mean? Of course we don't have any creative ideas. We don't do anything creative. Magic didn't have his own shoe. Bird didn't have his own shoe. The commercial you saw on the dock for that shoe, that didn't exist when Michael came out. Michael forced them to at least have a commercial for a model of a shoe. They weren't doing anything before then. And so he would never have had a brand had he not gone with Nike. That's why I pushed him so hard to visit Nike, because I thought it was one of the few companies that had a need. Sort of like if you're a coach, okay, and you've got 3 great centers on your team and you're recruiting a new guy to come to the team who's a center, he might not want to play because he's not going to see the court. And so Converse didn't have it. They might have had a need for another great player, but they weren't going to utilize him effectively, whereas Nike was like the new kid on the block. They were young. They had some very good players, but nobody like a Bird or a Magic. They were a distant third behind Adidas and Converse. And I thought they were hungry. And because they were hungry, they would be flexible to do something that was unprecedented and give a rookie player his own line of stuff. And so the earth would have been flat had Michael gone with Converse.
Kyrie would agree. But it's just crazy to think about this billionaire, really, it wasn't going to be just from his earnings on the court. Like without the Jordan brand deal, he would have been plenty successful and plenty wealthy, but what that's created for him from an income standpoint is just wild to think about. And the last question that I'm going to ask, and I want to
flip that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Michael not gone to Nike, I'm not sure they'd be a $100 billion company. I think that the momentum that he created, early in the day, you're going to get a kick out of this. They used to call the company Mikey, because he was so, it is inexorably the most successful athletic endorsement in the history of professional sports. There's never been an endorsement. It's a $3+ billion company. Under Armour is less than half of that. And they have Curry and they have some great players, Brady. And so it's exactly like my relationship with Michael. I would say humbly, Michael made me. I was successful before I met him, but he absolutely made my career. And when people mention my name, the first thing they think of is Michael Jordan, which I'm very, very proud of. And I think the Nike relationship with Jordan helped propel him into superstardom as a marketer. And I think he helped propel Nike to new heights as a performance company.
It's actually the question that Josh wanted to ask, and I changed Josh's question. So shout out to Josh. My last question, and I'll try to summarize some of the stuff I saw in the chat with this last question. We're both in Washington, D.C., and I remember my dad many, many years ago meeting with you and saying, hey, here's this idea. What if Michael Jordan became an owner at the Wizards and did that, this and that? At the time, my dad was friends with the owner, Abe Pollin. And so I'm curious to get your perspective on his last dance, which was as a player with the Wizards, as an owner. And, as somebody who grew up around here, those memories are etched in sort of my mind, Brian Ashen put it in the chat. There's other people asking about Washington. There's a lot of Washingtonians on this call. What was your memories like, and what were your observations from his time in Washington, and what was that like for you, being courtside? I would imagine almost every night.
Well, first of all, let me put you in the picture. I'd say in 46 years, by far the worst relationship I ever had with an owner in sports, in any sport, was with Abe Pollin. He reneged on his agreement with Juwan Howard. He reneged on his agreement with Rex Chapman. There were a lot of people I knew that, for a man who was famous for honoring his word, he clearly did not honor his word, and we had a terrible relationship. And so I got contacted by Ted Leonsis, who I have a great relationship with. And he wanted Michael to become an owner of the Wizards in his group, which is called Lincoln Holdings. So we met in Chicago, and I thought the idea of bringing Michael to Washington to be part of an ownership group with Abe Pollin would be like if tomorrow morning, we had a treaty with North Korea to supply masks. I mean, it's beyond comprehension. But I thought that Ted, as a young, bright guy in tech, could be a second-generation business mentor to Michael. So I felt I taught Michael all I was capable of teaching him. He was 1999. He was 36 years old, and I thought that Ted could sort of take him under his wing with his group of really smart people, Sheila Johnson, Fairbanks, and so we made the deal. And I got to tell you, this is a great story. I'm going to take an extra few minutes.
Take as long as you want, David.
Okay, so we got the whole thing set up. Michael's could be the president of the team. And Wes Unseld calls me. I had a good relationship with Wes. And Wes says, I want to come to your office and I want to meet with Michael this afternoon. So he meets with Michael and he tells Michael that if Michael comes, he's going to quit. And just like with Phil Jackson, Michael says to Wes, if you quit, I'm not going to come. You are the face of the franchise. I respect you. You're a Hall of Fame player. And Wes said, no, you don't understand. It has nothing to do with you. This is about my relationship with Abe. Abe runs around trumpeting that I'm like his son and I'm the lowest paid GM in the league. He's screwing me. And so, I have to quit. And Mike said, please don't quit. As the president of the team, I'll take care of this. So they leave the office and Ted and Michael go to Abe's house in Bethesda for the final meeting to approve him as owner of the Wizards. And in his office, in his house, Abe says to Michael, what should I pay you to be the president of the team? And Michael, being highly experienced in business, gives him the perfect answer. So you should pay me whatever you think is fair. And so Abe says, well, I've canvassed the market for team presidents, and the range of fair salaries is between $1 million on the low end and $2 million on the high end. So I think I'd like to pay you $1 million. And Ted knows this is the moment of truth. Mike's going to say, hey, take a hike. I'm out of here. But instead, what Michael says to Abe is, I'll tell you what, why don't you pay me $2 million, give $1 million to me, which is what you want to pay me, and give the other $1 million and increase Wes's salary, which is exactly what happened. And Michael gave his $1 million to charity, by the way. He didn't take a dollar for running the team. And so he became an owner of Ted's group. And it was not in my comprehension that Michael would ever go back and play. And the reason he went back and played, despite all these theories about trying to keep up with Kobe, whatever, is because he thought the best way to motivate this motley group that had been aligned was to be on the court, sort of like he did in The Last Dance, and yell at Steve Kerr, yell at these guys, Dennis Rodman. So that summer, while he's considering whether he's going to play, I'm playing in this famous golf tournament called the Crosby in North Carolina, in Winston-Salem, the Big Crosby, which used to be in Pebble Beach. And I'm playing with a guy who's 74 years old named Don Murray. Great looking guy who's a 34 handicap. Now, for those of you who don't play golf, that means there's 18 holes. On every hole, he gets 2 strokes, except the easiest hole where he gets none.
He's doubly worse than me is what that means. He's 2 times worse than me.
No, you would definitely kick his ass. So, but he's a super guy. And the guy won an Academy Award in 1956 for a movie he made with Marilyn Monroe called Bus Stop. And the whole 3 days, I'm asking all about Maryland, but he wouldn't fess up what happened. Anyway, so the end of the first day, this will blow your mind. I don't want to try to say this to brag, just to set the table. Now, not being a competitive athlete, I'm a decent golfer. There's a crowd of 10,000 people to see. It's actually on TV. I go out the first hole and I get a birdie and I have a stroke, so it's an eagle. On the second hole, I go out, it's a par 5, and I'm putting for a natural birdie, which would be a double eagle. And I missed the putt, so I have two birdies. I'm 6 under after 4 holes, and I end up the day 13 under by myself. My guy, Don, doesn't get a single bogey. If he gets a bogey, it's a birdie with 2 strokes. He has all doubles and triples. So at the end of the first day, we're in first place, 13 under. And there's actual press tent. You have to actually go in the press tent and do an interview at this tournament. So I walk in, and the questions, everyone wants to ask me the same question, which is basically, we've seen you play for the last 6 years, and we know you completely suck in golf. Can you possibly explain how you're leading the tournament at the end of the first day? And so I wanted to say something funny and clever. So I said, well, I really wasn't going to say this publicly, but I made a bet with Michael that if I could win the Crosby in his home state of North Carolina, that he would not come back and play for the Wizards, which I thought was very clever until I saw all the reporters writing it down. And every freaking newspaper in the country the next day, and my ass is going to be cooked. So I leave the press tent, I call Michael. I said, how you doing? He goes, fine. Hey, what are you doing? So what am I doing? I'm glad you asked. So I'm playing the Crosby golf tournament in Winston-Salem. I said, how you doing? I said, oh, I'm really glad you asked again. I said, you wouldn't believe it, but I'm leading the tournament after the first day. I'm 13 under. He goes, God, what are they playing for the women's teams? You play miniature golf? How's that remotely possible? And so I said, well, I hope you're not mad, but I try to be funny. And I told him what I said, and I'm waiting. He goes, wait a minute. I think I played that tournament a few years ago. Isn't that like 3 days in a row, 3 rounds? I said, yeah. He said, you're winning after the first round? I said, yeah. He goes, oh, don't worry about what you said. You'll fall like a tent by day 3. And I actually won the damn thing. And so he came back and tried to be an inspiration on the court to the players. And I had this sinking feeling that Abe had promised him in front of David Stern, when he went to play, he had to put his ownership share, he had to give it up. That if he stopped playing, whenever he stopped playing, 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, Abe promised him in front of the commissioner, we couldn't put it in writing because it would have violated the salary cap. He promised him that he would give him his share back. But as the end of the season wore on, we started reading the stuff in the Washington Post that gave me the sinking feeling that Abe was once again going to renege on his word. So what he did was he had a series of meetings with the players, secret meetings, where they literally came into the parking lot, came up a secret elevator into his office, Stackhouse, Kwame Brown, all the people at Michael. He wouldn't renew Stackhouse's contract. He wouldn't extend it. And Stackhouse was mad. So he said Michael was a jerk. Michael was abusive. Kwame Brown, who was a major disappointment that our company represented, Michael was out all the time because he was the #1 pick. They all said Michael was a tyrant. So Abe used that information and he fired him. And I was beyond fried. He broke his word. He offered him $10 million, which he wasn't allowed to offer. It was against the cap. It was a violation of the cap, as like a buyout. And Michael told him to take the money and put it somewhere where Donald Trump thinks he can. If you stick a flashlight there, it could cure coronavirus. And so it was a terrible experience in Washington. Michael hardly ever comes back to Washington. And the last part of the story I left out is in the first game he plays, the very first game, Abe would not let us sit in his box. I invited John Thompson to the game, so we sat in Ted's box. So Abe didn't treat Ted very well. He didn't treat me very well, which I could live with. He certainly didn't treat Michael very well. It was not a good experience.
Anything you want to end on that is maybe more of a positive?
Sure. So, I like to say I love basketball. The game has given me tremendous personal pleasure, career satisfaction. It's enabled me to form lifelong friendships with very special people like Michael and Patrick, Elton Brand, Juwan Howard, Coach K, John Thompson, Phil Ford, Michael, John Lucas, many, many others. I've sort of lived my dream. Here in Washington, D.C., there are a few places, if any, in the country where I think that junior basketball is deeper, better, more talented guys. I have tremendous respect for coaches because they have such an amazing impact on young players at an early age, to form them as men, not just simply as NBA prospects. I wish the game were a little cleaner. I long for the days when you didn't, to answer Tisha's question, like when there wasn't so much cheating going on and you could get hired because you were the best, not simply because you were paying somebody the most money. I guess that's sort of Camelot, but I'm not mad. I have no regrets. I happen to be blessed to have a partner who is, a young rock star, who I hope will become the Keisha of women's agents, or the, Candace Parker, who you know quite well. Those coaches are out there. If you're players that are talented and you want to get someone who really knows what the hell they're doing to represent your players and navigate through a very complicated series of rules, it's going to get way more competitive. You should call Danielle and give her a buzz. I've really enjoyed this. I love your psychological insight into these things, because I think more than anything else, to be a great performer in any walk of life, whether you're playing sports or business, you have to have the right mindset for it. And I really respect what you're doing in this space.
Thanks, David. And I just want to thank you. We had chatted a couple of times before this to set it up, and I figured, all right, maybe we'll get David for like 30 minutes or an hour. You're like, Brian, how long do you want to go for? And so I know there are people, I'm watching the participants, there are people that have to go back to work, but to see about 100 of you stay on, and I know that I'm not alone in loving this. And just reading the comments section, Cameron Lynch, who played football at Syracuse and also played in the NFL, just said go Orange a couple times. So shout out to Cam and his agent, Spencer Canold, who's also a friend. But this has been really fun. And when I'm watching the documentary, all I'm thinking about is, what is David thinking during this? So I kept texting you and be curious about your perspective. So this was super fun to jump on, and I'm sure we're all going to enjoy the last 4 documentaries. And so just thank you very much. Shout out to Don Yeager also, and Jake Fingert and Brian Pitcher, Kelsey, all you in the chat. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And David, I just appreciate you sharing your time with us. Kellen Coleman, who you were on retreat with, who's a big North Carolina fan, also shout out. So I could go on and shout out all of you, but we're going to let him go. David, thank you so much, my man. Be well. Appreciate it. If y'all want to unmute, you're welcome to clap, or I see show your faces. Good to have you. And I'll see you hopefully on the golf course sometime in the next year. I don't know, whenever we're allowed to do that. And whenever I get approval from my wife to say I can go, which we'll see if that happens.
Got to work on your game in secret.
Yeah, exactly. Be well. Thank you all for joining. Appreciate it. I'll see all you very soon, and be well. Stay healthy, stay well. And David, thank you again.
My pleasure.